Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Kyle Roberts, and I am the Executive Director of the Congregational Library and Archives. Welcome to today's virtual program, Why Study Library History, a virtual discussion with Sophie Jones, Laura Miller, Matthew Sangster, and Norbert Schurer. To begin with, I want to acknowledge that the Congregational Library and Archive resides in what is now known as Boston, which is in the place of the Blue Hills, the homeland of the Massachusetts people, whose relationships and connections with the land continue to this day and into the future. For those of you joining us for the first time, the Congregational Library and Archives is an independent research library. Established in 1853, CLA's mission is to foster a deeper understanding of the spiritual, intellectual, civic, and cultural dimensions of the congregational story and its ongoing relevance in the 21st century. We do this through free access to our research library of 225,000 books, pamphlets, periodicals, as well as our digital archive with more than 110,000 images, many drawn from our New England's Hidden Histories project. Throughout the year, we offer educational programs and research fellowships for students and scholars, churches, and anyone interested in Congregationalism's influence on the American story. Please do check out our website, congregationallibrary.org, for more information about what we do and for news of forthcoming events. Now, today's talk is part of our winter seminar lecture series, which is inspired by our new online exhibit, Founding 56, the Congregational Library's original collection. In 1853, a donation of 56 print and manuscript works from 8 donors became the foundational collection for the newly minted Congregational Library. Though the collection now numbers nearly 250,000 items, the themes found within those initial volumes have had a significant impact on the library's development. Now, I'll confess that library history is a topic near and dear to my heart. As you will learn from today's presentation, it is a rich and generative approach to understanding the past. In 2018, I had the honor of editing this volume, Before the Public Library, Reading, Community, and Identity in the Atlantic World, 1650 to 1850, with Professor Mark Towsey of Liverpool. And you're going to hear a bunch about Mark today. He was unfortunately not able to join us, but he is the kind of the glue that has kept all of us scholars together. This volume that Mark and I were happy to edit was meant really as an entry point into a world of libraries that I think is very different than the one we know today. As we were crafting the introduction to the volume, we thought we kind of need to, maybe dispel some misconceptions about historic libraries. I think today it's fair to say that public libraries are valued as a vital public good and a fundamental plank of Western liberal democracies. Organized and funded by the state, the conventional assumption is that public libraries exist as a service to provide books to readers that readers can then borrow for free. When that core service is threatened, as it has been in recent years, on the one hand by the emergence of the digital book, and on the other by austerity measures on both sides of the Atlantic, communities protest against the potential loss of what they see as, a trademark of civilized society. This sacred idea of the free-to-access public library supported by taxation is, however, actually a relatively young one, dating back to the passage of the Public Libraries Act in 1850 in the United Kingdom and the founding of the Boston Public Library in 1852 in the United States. Now, the Congregational Library here was founded 3 years after that Public Library Act in Britain and 1 year after the founding of the Boston Public Library. And in many ways, the Congregational Library really actually looked back to a culture of libraries built not by the state, but by autonomous individuals and communities. And this library culture really flourished on both sides of the Atlantic for 2 centuries before 1850. During this time, and you're going to learn a bunch more about this period today, people founded private membership book clubs and subscription libraries. Well-to-do patrons formed libraries for specific audiences like mechanics and apprentices. Professional and artisan groups congregated in vocational libraries for association and self-improvement. Booksellers operated commercial libraries, hiring out books for profit. Coffee houses, taverns, inns, and other public spaces provided print material to be read and debated. And religious groups provisioned libraries for charitable purposes and to encourage spiritual awakening. It was really a kind of fascinating, unregulated world of libraries that, as you will learn, existed all over the settled parts of North America, as well as across Great Britain. Now, our speakers today are some of the leading scholars in North America and Great Britain recovering this important and often forgotten history of libraries. They are all, as you're going to learn, research associates or co-investigators on a major 5-year Arts and Humanities Research Council funded project, again led by our good friend Mark Towsey and the History Department at the University of Liverpool. This grant went from 2019 to 2023. Major outputs from the grant include an exciting new database, and you're getting a sneak peek today, and a volume of cutting-edge research, which we'll soon hear more about. So I'm going to introduce our 4 speakers today right now in order. And that way, so just kind of keep in mind, and you will see them, I will bring them up in turn for their talks. Then we will come all back together for a Q&A period. First up is Sophie Jones, lecturer in modern British history at the University of Liverpool. Her research focuses upon the sociocultural development of the North American colonies, in particular, the origins of political loyalism and the activities of loyalists during the American Revolution. She has published on a range of topics, including loyalism, early modern merchant families, 18th century subscription libraries, and early modern literacy. Her current book project explores variations of loyalism in the colony of New York. Following Sophie is Laura Miller, professor of English at the University of West Georgia. She studies the intersections of literature, media, and science during the 18th century. Her first book, Reading Popular Newtonianism, Print, the Principia, and the Dissemination of Newtonian Science, was published by the University of Virginia Press in 2018. Dr. Miller is currently working on a book which focuses on the connections between readership, scientific experimentation, and conceptions of early American government as experimental, as well as other projects related to library history, science, the digital humanities, and gender. Norbert Schurer is professor of English at California State University, Long Beach. His research focuses on literature and book history in the long 18th century. More specifically, he works on 18th century women writers, circulating libraries, and the Anglo-Indian encounter. He has published the anthology British Encounters with India with Tim Kieran in 2011, the collection Charlotte Lennox, Correspondence and Miscellaneous Documents in 2012, the cultural guide Berlin in 2014, and the local history study Boom and Bust, Minor Smith and his 1920s California bungalow mansions in 2015. As you can see, library historians have capacious interests. Matthew Sangster is professor of Romantic Studies, Fantasy, and Cultural History at the University of Glasgow. In the field of library studies, he has published on the 18th century records of St. Andrew University Library in the Review of English Studies, and he's led the Carnegie-funded Enlightenment Readers in Scottish Universities project, focusing on Glasgow. He's a co-investigator of the Books and Borrowing, 1750 to 1830, an analysis of Scottish borrower registers project out of the University of Stirling, and he's also going to give you kind of a sneak peek of that today. His other research interests include the Royal Literary Fund, fantasy literature, Romantic period London, literary institutions, and the media environment of the 1820s. His first monograph, Living as an Author in the Romantic Period, was published by Palgrave in January 2021. So I am now going to introduce, or actually invite, Dr. Jones to join us. I will turn it over to you, Sophie. Thanks so much for starting us off.
Brilliant. Thank you, Kyle, for inviting me to speak today, and thank you for taking the time out of your day to join us if you're in the audience. So I've got 10 minutes to introduce you to the 18th century libraries online database, which for convenience we're calling ECLO. Mark and I, Professor Towsey and I, are guilty of spending quite a lot longer than 10 minutes talking about it. So I'll do my best. What I'd like to do is talk through some of the sort of basic, more simple, more accessible searches where you might want to start, and to give you a bit of a sneak peek at some of the more complicated stuff that the database can do. For the sake of, so we're actually moving the, we're in the process of, how do I phrase this? Incorporating the database into the main website. So until that goes live, I'm going to share some screen grabs with you instead, which makes things a little bit easier. Okay, so I just wanted to explain first of all, in our database, we structure data under 3 different categories. So we have people who we call agents, we have books that we call works, and we have libraries. And I won't go into the hows and why we do that, but that's how we've decided to do it. So I'm going to show you a couple of simple searches. First, let's start by searching for a person. So the database contains 2 different groups of people, library members and library authors. So what I've done here is I've selected agents and I've started to type a name into the search box. So searching for Joseph will bring up anyone whose first name is Joseph or whose surname is Joseph. And as you can see, that brings up quite a lot of results. And this is great if you've got a particular individual in mind that you're looking for. You can start that way by just popping the name into the search box. We also have an option. So if you're unsure of spelling, you can do things like, if I just zoom it forward a little bit, John with an asterisk will then bring up people who are John, Johnson, and as you can see, that widens the number there, the resulting number, to over 2,000. So one thing we've learned, 18th century spellings are a little bit inconsistent, so it just makes things a little bit easier to navigate. You can also search for an individual if you know their name exactly. So I'm going to search for Benjamin Franklin, who is Franklin, Benjamin. And we have only one of him in our database. People who are library members have this little stack of books next to their name. So that's how you can tell who's a library member. And you can see that Benjamin Franklin also has this little pen next to his name as well. And that's because he's an author and a library member. So some people have both, they fall into both those categories. Some people actually have none. And these are people who are in the database because they're related to other library members. Quite often women, because women are particularly important in connecting certain families through strategic marriages and that sort of thing. And I wanted to make sure that as many, certainly in the library members that I researched, as many of those women who are part of the story but not necessarily part of the library, some of them are captured in here too. So now we've found our record, we can navigate it. So if you click on it, here we go. Everything appears to the right-hand side of the page. So on this section, you can view a person's biographical details, including their occupation. You can look at any library memberships that they hold, if they've written any books, anybody else that they're related to. And any of the underlined text here is hyperlinked. So if you're interested in a particular book or a particular individual that this person's related to, you can start clicking through and exploring. So we know that Benjamin Franklin has a business connection to William Dunlap. So if you click through onto William Dunlap, his information then pops up on the screen. Now, if they're available, where they do survive, this is where you can also see an individual's borrowing records. So if it's a library member, it's the books that they borrowed. If it's an author, it shows which of their books were borrowed. So we actually have a borrowing record for Benjamin Franklin's books, which were borrowed. We don't have his surviving borrowing records personally. But what we can do is we can click on here and it will expand and we can start seeing who's borrowing the books, which library they're borrowing them from, where we know this information. We've got their occupation, sometimes we know their religious affiliation, and we're able to see the date it was borrowed and usually how long it's borrowed for. Not all libraries give that information. So that's how we find an individual and what we can do with that. The next thing I'd like to show you is how to search for a book. So let's say, for instance, you wanted to search for all books with Britain in the title. So we select the option for works, we type in Britain, and we hit search. And that will bring up momentarily 174 results. Now that's great, but what if we wanted to expand that search a little bit more? So we can include Brit with an asterisk. And that will bring up, when I've clicked it, that expands our set of results to 374, which is significantly more. So that's books with Britain, British, or any other variation in the title. You can also search for Britain and history, and that brings up a set of results where books with both of those words in their title. And if you're looking for something quite specific, as I know that several of the members of our team do, you can type something like the history of England, and you can do that using exact phrase. Again, you can click through the book. This time we're looking at David Hume's History of England, because there are quite a few different versions of that, a text with that name held in the database. Oh, I've gone forward a tiny bit further than I wanted. So again, you can see the author's David Hume, and you can click through to see any other books written by him. And we can see he's quite a popular author in our database. And you can also see where their books, the borrowing records for that author on this page. But let's go back to Hume's History of England. So a couple of things to talk through here. This tab shows you which known editions of the book are held by libraries, and that's something that we're asked to talk about quite a lot. You can click on there, and the reason I'm being hesitant here is by clicking on their ESTC record, that will take you through to the English short title catalogue, which will tell you more about that particular edition. And the reason I'm hesitating is, for those of you that don't know, the British Library, which hosts that database, and that really important resource, suffered quite a severe cyber attack towards the end of last year, and is currently out of action for researchers. So what we've actually got here is a lot of valuable ESTC data that's otherwise not available, or not available in its complete form. But what this particular section here does allow us to see is which of the different known editions of Hume's History of England are held in different libraries within our database. And as you can see, they range from 1759 right through to 1789. If you're interested in which of the 42 libraries hold those 19 editions, you can see that by clicking on the relevant drop down. Here we go. So again, really, really popular text. And if you click on the borrowing records, we've got, this is everybody that we know of, because not all of the records survive, who's borrowed the History of England. And you can again see which library it's being borrowed from, who the people were, their occupations, and when they borrowed it, when they returned it, and how long they borrowed it for. Now, I think I'm a little bit over time, but I just wanted to reiterate, another place you might want to start is libraries. So if you actually click on the libraries option, all of the libraries appear. You can also type in Philadelphia if you wanted all of the libraries that we know existed in Philadelphia. And if you were to put something like New York, there are a couple of options here. And again, in exactly the same way as you navigate a person or a book, you can click through and navigate each of those fields to find out information about the library, information about their members, and where they survive, the complete borrowing records. All of this information is exportable as well. So if you do want to filter that out and extract it and use it for your own research, you're very welcome to do so. Because I've run out of time, I think I will stop sharing there, but I just wanted to flag, we do have some more videos on the 18th century Atlantic, the 18th century library's website. So please do feel free to have a look through those, which tell you in a little bit more depth about some of the more complex search features that you can use. I'll stop talking about the database and a little bit more about why I study library history. So I started what I wanted to do with my time is talk quite broadly about my pathway into library history, because it's not a field that I anticipated going into, but how it's really helped to reshape my understanding of the communities of people who I study. So I started my academic career as an early Americanist. When I was a history student, I was really intrigued by the history of the United States and particularly the colonial era. And I'm really pleased that we're doing this talk in Boston today, even if we're doing it virtually, because as a teenager, I'd visited Boston, I'd visited Salem, and visited some of the heritage sites in both of those places. And I really wanted to learn more about that period in history. So when I had the opportunity to look at that at university, I jumped at the chance. I really enjoyed it. So my research as a student looked at how consumer culture, including books, helped to disseminate ideas about Anglicized identities, mainly in New York. And then my postgraduate, my PhD research expanded on that to look more closely at political loyalism. Because what I really wanted to think about is, why did North Americans, and especially New Yorkers, why did they want to fight for the British cause and remain part of the empire? I was first introduced to libraries and library history during my PhD. So libraries were one of the components of a polite 18th century society. And I see that as being key to shaping both cultural and political identities, the existence of a public sphere. And it just so happened that New York has one of the oldest library societies that survived from the period. And it also helped that Professor Towsey, who's lead on the libraries project, was my PhD supervisor at the time. So he gave me quite a big nudge in the direction of library history and the history of reading. Now, little did I know at the time that the social library was an American invention rather than the British one. So I've written on that considerably since. Libraries are, at this period, they didn't have purpose-built buildings. They sort of slotted in where there was room. So the New York Society Library was originally held at City Hall, now Federal Hall, although I think it's been demolished and rebuilt a few times. And you can actually see that City Hall from this plan had a few functions. It was the prison and the courtroom, and was a multifunctional space. And I think it's really important to remember that libraries sort of slotted into existing alongside other features of 18th century life. So when I applied to join this team as a postdoctoral researcher, the reason I did was that I wanted to use libraries to think more about colonial American communities. And I'm really interested in seeing whether loyalists were members of social libraries. Spoiler, they were, but how they interacted with fellow library members who held different political beliefs. And I also wondered whether the types of books that people were reading in libraries might have shaped their politics. So one of the things I wondered about, and nobody actually knew until this project, is whether libraries in regions that were predominantly loyalist, did they hold more books about Britain or that were pro-Britain than libraries in areas that were more revolutionary in their politics. So one thing about the database that really excites me is that you can do just that. You can look at library membership lists, you can follow select individuals. Where we have it, you can follow their reading histories and their changing tastes. It's quite interesting to compare that against what else is happening in their lives at a particular point of time. And it's also allowed me to contextualize loyalists, to see who they lived with, who they interacted with before the American Revolution, which was in many ways a civil war, before that disrupted those communities, sometimes irreversibly. I didn't have time to show you today, but you can also look at what we call collection overlap. So you can look more closely at whether particular libraries in particular regions held more of a specific type of book than others. Are some libraries reading more politics and some reading more religion, and how does that vary according to place? I've put the Library Company of Burlington on screen here. So this is in New Jersey, because in studying library history, particularly the smaller or more modest libraries in our database, like Burlington, and Burlington's a fantastic library, it's got a wonderful history, I've really begun to rethink the nature of early American communities. And in particular, I've realized that communities that were located away from the urban centers still shared many features in common with the sprawling metropolis of New York or Philadelphia, and Burlington's sort of in the middle of those. Maybe it had those features on a bit of a smaller scale, but all of the key components were there. So ideas about what needed to be done, what was polite, what was genteel, and what was necessary for civic improvement, all of those ideas spread much further and were much more pervasive than I first assumed. So even communities with limited resources, both in terms of finance and manpower, they knew they needed to invest in a library. And we can see from the mission statement that's on the screen at the moment just how important libraries are thought to be for underpinning a genteel education. And that's just one example. So that's really led me to ask if these sorts of ideas about 18th society are very specific to Anglicized 18th century society were reaching into these smaller communities, what other ideas were filtering through? And at this point, I'll put myself back on silent and I'll hand over.
My overall research focuses on the ways ordinary individuals encountered scientific ideas. And my current book project, as Kyle just mentioned, focuses on a specific subset of 18th century public science. It's sort of, early American and also late 18th century Britain. I focused more tightly since then to study public health and public science as a center of the project, including health and wellness topics, as we would call them today. I'm focusing on preventative care and the origins of public health, which is an under-researched but timely subject. Today, I'll describe some of the problems my current research addresses and illustrate how valuable library history can be in helping us to understand the 18th century and 2024 a little bit better. At no point in history have all people had accurate understanding of preventive care in 1700 or in 2024. I'm interested in what allowed misinformation to spread and how misinformed were people by the printed text that they read. Was there surprisingly good information in unlikely places, including novels or old wives' tales or other titles written by people without expertise in the subject necessarily? In terms of harm, the 18th century had numerous outbreaks of preventable disease and illness, and poor understanding of preventive care that could contribute to further spread and harm, if not practiced. Even so, some common cultural practices reduced harm. We often talk about this in terms of frequent alcohol consumption. The water itself might have been a lot less bad for you than something with just a tiny bit of alcohol in it to kind of purify whatever was in there. In sources, there is a lot of imbalance. Most reports of reading focus on well-known elite writers. Most published reading experiences are of reading fiction. This project is looking in some different places and trying to understand readers and writers who often weren't written about, people who weren't considered a part of 18th century history before. And in scholarship, again, there's always been a focus on the elite figures who have extensive manuscripts and correspondences that survive them. Historians of science often write about particular innovations in public health rather than the way reality reflected received ideas about health. So I want to help extend that conversation and spend more time showing how the reception of printed books can fill in cultural spaces and contribute to knowledge of the period. So individual borrowers, AKA people, I want to know what people understood about the tremendously influential ideas that shaped their era and what information they read and used to develop their ideas. As you've just seen from Sophie, we have that in our digital resources, at least in some form, and there's incredible richness there. Regional idiosyncrasies, kind of piggybacking on Sophie's comment, libraries are part of communities, and the books that are accessed regularly by the members of a community help shape its culture, while also reflecting that culture or reflecting those mindsets. It's easier for us to understand, not just when many books are published on a topic, but when those books make themselves into a library that is accessed by hundreds of people regularly. Unintentional successes. Recently, there was a medieval recipe for an antibiotic that people recreated and actually found it useful in treating MRSA. So I'm interested in the knowledge the 18th century circulated that we can use in the 21st. You know, what were people reading at these libraries? And were these texts possibly better at convincing readers to do whatever is in them than some of the sources we use today? So some ways forward, using both library history and the problems I am identifying in the study of this topic. Knowing how public health evolved helps us see where we can direct it. And knowing what its origins are, I think is a really useful pursuit, especially in this cultural moment. Also, in this country, especially, we spend countless hours hearing interpretations of a late 18th century mindset, that of the framers, how to understand the Constitution, etc. And with current public health debates being as intense as they are, I want to see which ideas were actually held in common by many people, or even if we can understand that. I would also like to see us using more successful arguments about preventive care. It's a hard time out there, and I think we are struggling in terms of healthcare messaging. So, my research is not exactly that, but it informs that, I think. New centers of power. I want to learn more about the realities and not just the surfaces of 18th century health. I'm hoping that the story this book tells of the 18th century is one with a more diverse and less predictable cast of characters. And so far, I think it is. And those characters can include all manner of people, as you see here. Health practices were not always the same in reality as in theory. Going to a spa might mean ending up in more of a soup with a whirlpool attached, no less. Our database and the project in Scotland that Matthew is going to describe, which includes some spa aficionados, they're already giving us so much information. And I think it's going to be a very productive journey. I encourage others to come along and study library history with us. Thank you.
All right. Hello. Hello from California. Good morning. It's still morning in California. Thanks to Kyle for organizing this session. Thanks to my co-panelists for their interesting contributions. And thank you to you, the audience, for being here. We look forward to your questions afterwards. So please, that's how we learn and refine our ideas as well. So the main question of our panel today is, why study library history? In attempting to answer that question, I'll explore the tension between the two academic disciplines alluded to in that question, literary studies and history. On the one hand, I think library history can tell us something about what books specifically were owned, borrowed, and read in the past. This is a literary issue that touches on the larger question of the canon, that is, what counts as literature with a capital L. On the other hand, library history can help us think about the significance of books in a larger sense. In this sense, library history is a part of social history that investigates who had the time, literacy, and financial means that made them able to read, and examines what genres were popular and available. Here, library and history come together in a version of what is sometimes called distant reading, which means looking less at individual books and more at larger cultural patterns. Our 18th Century Libraries online project gives us tools to examine these questions from a more data-informed perspective. As you heard earlier from Kyle and Sophie in particular, the project focuses mostly on subscription libraries. But this form of library was not the only kind of library in the 18th century. For instance, there were book clubs, associational and institutional libraries, such as university libraries or dissenters' libraries or congregational libraries. There were also parish libraries, cathedral libraries, coffee houses, as Kyle mentioned, and private collections. One other form that was especially widespread and important was the circulating library. This was a library that was organized by a single proprietor, usually a bookseller, and offered books for rent. Basically, individuals could purchase a membership in a circulating library and then check out a certain number of books for a certain time and for a certain price. In other words, a circulating library was a little bit like a Blockbuster was 10 or 20 years ago, and that you could visit the establishment and ask for the title or book or video that you wanted. By comparing the holdings of subscription libraries and circulating libraries in the same place and at the same time, we can learn more about the literary canon, the popularity of certain genres, specific books, and the significance of libraries for culture in general. This is why I think it is important to study library history. For the rest of my short presentation today, I will give you a quick example from the small town of Stamford in Lincolnshire in the northern English Midlands. Between 1787 and 1790, there was both a subscription library and a circulating library here. With the help of 18th century libraries online, it is possible to compare the holdings of these libraries. For instance, somewhat surprisingly, the Stamford subscription library held more recent books than Herod's circulating library. About 60% of the holdings of the subscription library were from the last 5 years. Since this library was the form where the group of owners chose the books, this high percentage suggests that these readers were interested in the latest publications. In contrast, it appears that the circulating library, organized by a proprietor, in this case William Herod, had an interest in more established works. Here, the data actually contradict the stereotype that circulating libraries only purchase the very latest publications. A different stereotype about forms of libraries is confirmed by the data from 18th century libraries online with regard to genre. At Herod's circulating library, almost 90% of the holdings were novels. And keep this in mind when you listen to Matthew's presentation later on. In popular discourse of the 18th century, circulating libraries were condemned as, quote, the evergreen tree of diabolical knowledge, because they gave readers access to, quote unquote, bad literature, such as novels, which supposedly corrupted young men and women. In contrast, the Stamford subscription library held a much wider variety of genres, though even here, imaginative literature in its various genres made up about 30% of the holdings. At the same time, there is a small overlap between the two libraries in 5 specific books, and Sophie talked earlier about overlaps as well. 3 of these titles are novels: Miguel Cervantes' Don Quixote, François Fenelon's The Adventures of Telemachus, and Jean-François Marmontel's Moral Tales. And 2 are English periodicals, The Spectator and The Idler. This overlap suggests that there may have been a small canon of books that any library was expected to provide. This canon included non-English works, but mostly consisted of didactic literature, whether in fictional or essayistic form. By studying library history through a data-informed perspective with tools such as 18th century libraries online, therefore, we can tentatively conclude, in terms of literary studies, that different types of libraries held works of different ages and promoted different genres of literature. For that reason, in terms of social history, we can speculate that readers used different libraries depending on what kind of books they were looking for at any given moment. At the same time, there was some overlap between the libraries, so it is possible that at least in the late 18th century, libraries contributed to a cosmopolitan canon. These kinds of questions and potential answers are why I study library history. Thank you.
Thanks, Norbert. I'm bringing up the rear in this series of presentations, so I'll try and keep this fairly short so we can go on to questions. So I'm interested in library history for a couple of different reasons. One is that I think libraries are just fascinating as institutions. Like Kyle, I've also worked in libraries as well as in academia. I worked at the British Library for quite a long time during my PhD as a cataloguer. So the kind of institutional politics and the strange quiddities about what appears in libraries, the sort of clash between the desire to have a comprehensive organizing system and the way that plays out in practice as a series of individuals don't necessarily all agree with each other, try and implement that system in different ways at different times, is really interesting. But I don't want to talk about that at great length now. I want to talk instead about the way that libraries provide us with a way to get at a more complicated and interesting history of reading, something that a number of the previous speakers have also alluded to. I think quite a lot of our accounts of reading come from pretty elite positions. That's effectively the people who can have the sort of leisure time to give their opinion on what people should be reading. They're also often, when we write about the history of books, we often take the point of publication as the key moment of interest. So we're less good at tracking the longer histories of books having influence in the world. And I think looking at libraries and the books that keep circulating or the books that are only really popular for a season can be really interesting. There is a big problem, of course, with looking at the history of reading at all, and most reading acts are unrecorded. The history of reading is really the history of writing about reading, and therefore, in all sorts of ways, performative. But I think in some ways, looking at institutional records like library records does let us get around that formativity in certain ways. When we're looking at borrowing records, which are the main things that I'm interested in, there's always a question about whether borrowing equates to reading. It's obviously not a direct equivalence. I'm sure everyone on this call has a book that they have borrowed from the library with the best of intentions, that has sat renewed a number of times, but yet unopened has been returned guiltily after a substantial period of time, never having passed from the intention to read to the actual act of reading. But I think by looking at library borrowing records and at the other records that survive in libraries, you can get a sort of more nuanced sense of what reading in the past might mean. You can get a sense of local difference. You can get a sense of larger trends. You can get a sense of the way that people read books in different kinds of situations. So I'm going to talk about two examples, the first with slides that Carl's going to help me with, and then I'm going to show quickly the Books and Borrowing website. So I think one of the really fascinating things you can do with library records is look at the sort of micro details of book use, looking at these books that survive in institutional collections that have evidence of the way that they've been read in the past. There's a kind of sense that reading around the turn of the 19th century is becoming a more solitary and private enterprise. I think that's a kind of romantic conception which doesn't really hold true in institutional libraries in particular, where there's a lot of talking back in books. So this is a book that in our analysis of Scottish libraries we found read a great deal. This is Charles Rolland's Ancient History. This is the Glasgow copy, and you can see here the students do not agree that Charles Rolland is suitably qualified as a professor of eloquence. They've scored out that particular part of his long qualifying thing, talking back to him effectively. And you see similar corrections in other parts of the book. 18th century students love picking up on people's bad grammar in the same way that their own grammar is probably corrected by their professors. You also get this sort of sense in libraries that there's a very particular set of social rules for working with books in general and institutional books in particular, but that these are not always followed. This is, I think, my favorite bit of late 18th century marginalia. This is a long advertisement in a book at St Andrews, arguing that it's a scandalous thing to write upon the books in the university library deposited there for such persons as please to have recourse to them. Then the annotator goes on, I myself am hurried along by my mind to write this as a effectively as a warning to tell other people not to write in the books, but it is in this form of this lavish upside down advertisement at the bottom of the pages. And this is not a unique piece of marginalia. This comes up quite commonly. So there's this sort of playful tension between the book as something where the book's voice should be allowed to speak to others and the book's voice as something that should be talked back to, in similar way to the institutional voice. There's a really interesting like microhistory in St Andrews of the war between the students and one of their librarians, William Wieland, who they all despise. And there's a whole lot of marginalia gets into the collection at this point as the students try and resist what they see as Wieland's tyranny, including a lot of attacks on him. And you can also see kinds of very different engagement with the narrative. So these are 2 pages from the Glasgow copy of Tom Jones, Henry Fielding's novel. On the left, you have this sort of Tom Jones responding to Sophia Weston with kind of embarrassment, and you get this sort of sense that his response to her is truth and nature in the margin there. So a kind of sense that the affect of the novel has been communicated to the reader. But then on not very much later in the book, you get the smallpox turned into the straightforward pox in this set of eliminations. Although it's a set of eliminations they're not wholly approved of. You get say something about, I think that's what a damnable beast written at the bottom there, condemning these eliminations. So I think where you can use the larger patterns of borrowings within books where within certain kinds of institutional collections to find the books themselves and see occasionally how the people reading it. Obviously, marginalia only appears fairly rarely, but I think it's still been undertapped as a resource for looking through books. The other project that I've been working on alongside 18th century libraries online is really a sister project. They were conceived out of a network that Mark Towsey ran in the mid-2010s, and the idea was that the 18th Century Libraries Online project would cover a broader range, focusing principally on subscription libraries, and Books and Borrowing focuses on borrowing registers rather than the broader range of materials that 18th Century Libraries Online looks at, and only on Scottish libraries, covering a wide range of different kinds of libraries, including institutional libraries, circulating libraries, other kinds of libraries, parochial libraries, gifted collections, and those sorts of things. There's some details here. I particularly want to highlight the research fellows who did an awful lot of the work actually interpreting the borrowing registers of these libraries, which are often extremely complicated and involved. Often a borrowing is recorded with a very short title. Sometimes that title is crossed through as a means of marking returns. In one particularly horrible case, the calendar of Westerkirk Library, borrowings happen once a month and recorded only by a number on an actual sort of calendar grid. So you then have to cross-reference with a not entirely reliable catalogue to try and work out what's going on. So we've been working on this for the past 3 years in concert with Mark's project, and we're now just about at the point where the database is available for public testing. So I'm just going to show a couple of things that I think speak interestingly to 18th century libraries online. So this is the sort of the libraries page. The site is just borrowing.ster.ac.uk. This is our libraries. You have to zoom out a little bit to get our most northerly library, which is Library on Orkney. And you have to zoom in quite considerably to get the Edinburgh libraries to split up: the Chambers Circulating Library, the Advocates Library, the Library of the Royal High School of Edinburgh, and Edinburgh University Library. We found a lot more borrowing records once we started digging into it than we were aware of initially. So we think there are probably at least 500,000 borrowings in registers that the project has scanned and made available. We've transcribed about 150,000 of those into good machine-readable data, interpreting them. This is a kind of sense of what those decades cover. So you can highlight this and see the various breakdown of libraries. We focused on we tried to cover full runs from the smaller libraries, but the Edinburgh University Library, the Advocates Library, and the Library at St Andrews have enormous runs of surviving borrowing records. So for those, we took samples. We would hope in a future project to be able to expand upon that a bit. But you can see we've got a sort of a record of about 145,000 transcribed borrowings, which will be expanding on slightly over the course of the rest of this year. You can these are bar charts made by our amazing digital technician Brian Aitken, and you can illuminate various things if you just want to see particular libraries. This is a very clicky site, which is very pleasing. You can get a sense of the overall facts and figures here, the sort of scale of things, the most popular works borrowed. We shared across the two projects the structure where we have book work, which is the conceptual sort of thing. So Hume's history in all its editions and forms. Then the book edition, which is a particular book printed by a particular publisher at a particular time. And the book holding, which is a particular copy of an edition held in a library. So you get slightly different things here. You can see here that Holdings, the Royal High School, which is setting quite particular books from its limited collection, dominates that chart, whereas that's not the case higher up. You can see here popular authors across our period of the late 18th and early 19th century. Some sort of suspects like Walter Scott you might expect to see there from the later period. Mark Tousey was very pleased to find that his contention about the importance of history as a genre for understanding the world is held up by Charles Rolland, David Hume, William Robinson being so high up in this chart. You can also get a sense of prolific borrowers, popular genres. So the two projects share their genre classification, which our postdoctoral research associate Kit Baston spent a lot of time refining down to something that produced meaningful categories. You can see borrow occupations shared across projects, and you can see percentage borrowings across genre, across the various systems. I'm just going to very quickly show you a couple of libraries in particular. So this is Chambers Circulating Library as a library that works alongside what Norbert was showing us earlier on. So we only have, this is the only circulating library borrowing register we're aware of, and Scotland only covers this period right at the end of the 1820s. So you can see here for all the libraries, we've got bar charts showing what period is actually covered from what could be covered. And then you get a sense of the popular borrowings, so very much extremely contemporary novels for the most part, and periodicals. All of the novels borrowed in the top 10 here were published within the 3 years immediately before, so this is a very present-minded set of borrowers, or at least in their terms of their borrowings from the circulating libraries, although often they borrow from a whole series of different libraries. You can see the occupations, and you can see here the genre breakdown. So not dissimilar to Norbert's breakdown, although fiction here is only about 2/3 of the genres borrowed in terms of total number of books circulating, and slightly fewer in terms of the percentages of borrowings. The nice thing about the site is that you can click through. So you want to see what are these travel books going out at, you can just click on that segment of the pie chart and it'll bring up all of those, section them up and let you divide them by borrow occupations or by their authors, and by their ESTC numbers if you happen to have memorized the entire ESTC. Obviously the ESTC numbers only exist for 18th century books, so they're less useful for Chambers Circulating Library. But that's sort of a way of moving from these larger statistical things that you can do libraries down into the micro details to see what's actually going on. Just one more library quickly. This is St Andrews University Library, which I've just picked because it shows you a broader span of things. And you can see here a very mixed set of generic borrowings from the data that we've entered. So despite the fact this is a university library in which the students are taking a course that runs from classics through rhetoric and Bell-let to natural philosophy, and then the graduate programs are mainly medicine, law, or theology. There's a really diverse range of things, including prevalence of fiction, quite a lot of fiction, quite a lot of Bell-let, surprisingly high amount of poetry. One of the things we found out is that not a lot of these libraries are used heavily for borrowing poetry, particularly later on. So if you're thinking about the Romantic period, Romantic poetry is not in the top of what's circulating from libraries, so you always have to think about the parts of the picture that are erased. People may be accessing poetry from elsewhere. So I think that's a good point really to wrap this up, that I think the survivals of, in terms of evidence of the history of reading are vanishingly small compared to the proportion of total reading acts that must have occurred in the 18th and early 19th centuries. So it's always important to try and think about what you have to draw from, as opposed to what might actually have occurred. But I think should be really grateful in terms of libraries for the kinds of evidence they record that are different from the kinds of evidence elsewhere, sort of the micro-histories of tiny interactions with books in terms of use markings of various kinds, and these larger runs of borrowing lists or books catalogued, or these sorts of things that let you take a more quantitative approach, at least to an aspect of book use in the 18th and 19th centuries, and let you get away from these more anecdotal accounts into something that's going to represent a broader range of types of people. So I will stop there. Thank you very much.
That was great, Matt. Thanks so much. Let me invite each of our speakers to turn on their cameras and to unmute themselves. Excellent. Where to begin? I mean, the questions are flowing in. I'm just sort of blown away by all of the different approaches that you're taking, all the different questions. And I guess an unfair question would be like, is there any question that can't be answered by looking to library history? I mean, I think that we see such generative approaches here. I wonder, and this is, I should have said a little bit more about this in the beginning, but I'll put Sophie on the spot. All of us kind of grew up, as becoming library historians, seeing the kind of the model of library history that was often reconstructing one library, right? That the amount of time it took without a digital application to kind of understand a library collection or its borrowing records meant that you didn't often have a lot of time to look at a lot of other libraries in the process. Books and borrowing and 18th century collections online, libraries online, both took a very different approach. So Matt, remind us, I think, what, 18 libraries with 100,000?
Yes, 18 libraries, and we've got, we'll get to 150,000 borrowing acts from those libraries. And then I think for 18th century libraries online, it's a far broader range of libraries with the catalogues input, but I think there are 10 libraries with surviving borrowing records in that database, Sophie, is that correct? But in both cases, we wanted to do these big projects with multiple people and multiple postdocs involved because of that scale question, that quite a lot of library history is a particular person or a particular library, and the only way to get a comparative approach is to get a big group of people together with plenty of time and really dig into those records and put them next to each other.
And I think, the original ambitions, which have come pretty close for the 18th century libraries online, was every known surviving library catalog from the Anglo-Atlantic world. So there's Canada, there's North America, there's Ireland, there's Wales, there's Scotland, there's England in there in some capacity. And then borrowing records, as Matt was saying, from initially maybe 10, I'm not sure. I know that's a ton of work, so I'm not sure if over 4 or 5 years that all got in there. But this is just an unprecedented scale, right, for looking at this surviving work. And I'm curious for all of you coming out the other end of it, you've all been co-investigators. What does this has it ruined it for you that you can't go back to the individual library study? Or what does working at scale mean for each of you?
I think one thing that sorry, Laura, just jumped in.
No, it's fine.
I think one thing that I didn't have a chance to show, but I'm happy to talk about, is we've been able, I think, Laura, you mentioned the regular people, the people that haven't quite made it through to discussions we have today. And one thing that I really like about the database is it allows you to see who's actually the most active borrower. Who's borrowing not only the highest number of times, but who's borrowing the most unique number of books, because some people are reading the same material over and over again, and that's great, but also some people are reading huge swathes of material, and it's quite often people that, with all due respect, we've not heard of before, we've not encountered before, but in their communities at that time they were really significant. And in the same way, I know both Matt and Norbert mentioned the canon. We think we know who people were reading in the 18th century, but actually by looking at which books were the most commonly read, there's a lot more female authors in that list that have made, that we know about today. So people like Charlotte Turner Smith, incredibly popular, but probably not, in the top 5 that you might think of automatically. So I really like the way that by drawing on such a diverse range of records, we're able to challenge some of those misconceptions and shine a light on people who might have been a little bit neglected or somehow got lost along the way.
Yeah, just to kind of respond to that, I mean, we're looking at the introverts. And I'm so excited by that. You know, the people who are doing the most reading from these libraries, you know, in general, they're spending a lot of time with their books. And there's something, I think, that draws us as scholars who are also doing that to those kinds of subjects. In terms of scale, one thing that Kyle mentioned that I immediately, a little light bulb went on, that idea of putting every single catalog online was eventually how, when I worked on the English Broadside Ballad Archive at Santa Barbara, that still has a little ticker that says, here's the percentage of early English ballads we've put online. And they're like 80% or something now. So, I mean, those goals can seem wild for a 4-year AHRC grant, but I mean, you know, 20 years ago, I'm old now, we wrote that first really big grant for the NEH. And so it is something that can be done as long as people like us are kind of committed to those applications and the project and that work.
And if I could jump in for a second. So I just wanted to qualify one thing. It's not all catalogs, it's all subscription library catalogs, right? It does not have cathedral libraries, it does not have circulating libraries,
University.
which, you know, would be a whole different, you know, ball game. Some of the circulating library catalogs have 20,000 books in them. So if there's anybody in the audience who happens to have a few $1 million to fund the next grant, we would love to continue this work. We've also thought about maybe making it sort of more of a crowdsourcing thing, but that there's all kinds of, you know, as you can imagine, issues about that in terms of ensuring accuracy from kind of a scholarly point of view. And then I guess sort of in terms of Kyle's original question about the scale, I actually don't think there's that much of a contrast. I mean, you know, like obviously you know, what I was presenting, that was 2 libraries. I was still focusing on a very specific thing. But I think what you know, 18th century libraries online and books and borrowings allow us to do is to contextualize this in a much more informed way, right? We in the past, you know, you sat in the one library that you had access to, and you looked at that, and you sort of speculated on, well, what might this mean in the larger scheme of things? But now we actually have, you know, these big data sets that can help us understand better what's happening in the individual libraries.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. And I don't think the scale stuff precludes doing more detailed work. I think it just provides that contextual stuff. Both of these are obviously like big UK government funded projects. And I think the idea was not that we would do them and then we would extract all of the research juice from them and then stop. They're supposed to be facilitative. So there are definitely queries that sort of us on both projects really want to ask these records, but that won't exhaust the records by any means. And the idea is that people will not now need to get a big grant to access that contextual information to look at what they're seeing or to investigate things in the records about particular figures they're interested in, particular trends they're interested in, or those sorts of things. I think it really, the doing stuff on the scale just opens up a whole load more microhistories of individuals or particular books or particular authors that now it'll be a lot easier for anyone anywhere to investigate.
I think the resource being out there will challenge us as scholars in thinking about the arguments we want to make or the statements we want to make. Because I will say, looking at religious holdings, especially in North American libraries, it's all over the place. You know, that you know, we might be looking for a canon or a core set, but what we find is that Springfield has 40% of its collection being sermons, and a place in Rhode Island has 5%, and they're both religious towns in some way. But what we see is, and this goes back to great points you've all been making about community choice, right? And the specific nature, and I think, Norbert, you were getting at this, people use different types of libraries for different types of reading needs. And I think, Sophie, you were making that comment as well, right? So understanding, I think we have a more sophisticated understanding as well that we can go into in thinking about these periods, these libraries and what they can do. I will just share that on the scale issue. So I was writing about sermons, and I was excited to find somebody who read more sermons, like an absolute number of borrowed, more sermons than anyone else in the whole catalog, in the whole database. He also just borrowed more books than anyone else in the database. So the 50 sermons out of the 650 books we know he borrowed was actually a very small percentage of his borrowing, but as an absolute number, it was much broader. So there's these great ways that I continue to learn how to understand the data, right? And how to think about what it means to kind of contextualize it. The questions are rolling in. There's questions for everyone here, so I'm just going to jump right in. Patrick Hayes, great friend of the library down in Philly, asks, the ECLO database has a wonderful set of features, including the ability to notate religious affiliation of borrowers. So Sophie, this might be coming towards you, because I think you've done more of this notating than I have. Isn't that a murky category? How would you class Benjamin Franklin, for example? So maybe not surprising, Patrick down in Philly has Franklin on his mind. Is he an Anglican? Is he a deist? What criteria are used to determine a subject's religious affiliation?
Brilliant question. And I agree. Murky is probably the best way to describe it. So my colleague, so the way the project was structured is I worked on the North American libraries and my colleague worked on the British libraries. And I know sort of the records he was working on in Bristol in particular, it was a lot clearer. Religious affiliation was a lot clearer. The way I've approached it, I'm not going to even try and categorize Benjamin Franklin, but the way I've approached it instead is where I've encountered biographical details about people predominantly through Quaker records, I've been able to say with a certain degree of certainty, this person is probably a Quaker, or at the very least, they engage with the Quaker community. So that's what I've done. There are also a couple of we have a couple of library members in New York who we know are Jewish. Now, how useful that is as a label, as a category for religious affiliation, I'm not sure, but I think it's really interesting to highlight that there is a diversity amongst library members. So I've put it when I'm fairly certain, and when I'm not sure, I've not put it. As a kind of caveat, when the database goes live, which should be imminently, we have included a glossary document where we've explained some of our decision making behind certain terminologies and certain data that we have captured and certain data that we haven't. So I hope your answers your question. Very murky, and I don't want to sort of tread on any toes, so I've only put it when I'm fairly sure.
Were you doing that in the Books and Borrowing project, Matt?
We have we're not recording, I think, a religious affiliation. We are recording using the taxonomy that Sophie and Max developed for 18th century libraries online, people's professional identity or job roles, which is also difficult, particularly if someone lives over 50 years and is at a number of different libraries. We had some difficult stuff about transforming their discussions of the law into the Scottish legal context and the religious categories into the very different contexts of the Church of Scotland. I mean, I guess we have basically stuck our necks out and tried to give data where we are reasonably confident in where it's useful. We expect to be corrected on a number of things, and that will be a part of refining the databases. Similarly, with our transcriptions and identifications of books, we have in both databases have a kind of formal system called confidence intervals. So if we are absolutely certain that a book is the exact edition borrowed, we will label it as such. But if we are taking a sort of best guess, we're pretty sure it's this edition, but there's a reasonable chance it could be the Dublin edition still or something along those lines, we've marked that up. And so we've done that because we have a lot more time than people using our database will have to research particular books. But we also want to be clear that these databases are not like pure facts. In a lot of cases, they're interpretation of these historical records, which are kept in often quite spotty ways, in ways that require particular, which are sort of sometimes reliant on the knowledge of a person who's now 2 centuries dead for their full interpretation and those sorts of things. So we've done our best, and we're trying in both projects to be frank about that in terms of our FAQs and descriptions.
The next 2 questions, one for Laura and one for Norbert, and I'll do the one for Laura first. Both get us to libraries then and now and their relationship to society. So Molly Hardy, the great book historian, says, I love how applications of library history demonstrated in these excellent talks reflect what a capacious, rich topic library history is. Amen. Laura's presentation has me thinking about the past as prologue, and I wonder if the data you're analyzing offers any insights into the relationship between library holding and censorship.
Yeah, was that the end of the question, or is there?
Yeah, that's the question, yeah.
Okay, thank you, Molly. Hi. And yes, I mean, I think to some extent, and this is a talk I gave a couple of months ago, because one of the public health issues I think about is venereal disease. And, there is a lot of, self-selection out of borrowing books that imply a complex status to the reader. And so what I've ended up looking at are adjacent books that offer preventative health information. So, did people who were interested in kind of living a reasonably chaste life, perhaps intentionally, perhaps unintentionally, take better exercise, eat better, make sure they get enough sleep at night, all the things that we are encouraged to do now, there were versions of in the 18th century. So, in that way, I think there is a prologue, or there is a connection. But I also think that if people were borrowing more controversial books, that might not have been written down. There might have been, off the books that people would take or be able to read, personal copies of books. And so I find it really exciting to kind of learn where those limits are with different readers, and learn where those limits were with different libraries. There were certainly books that libraries held. I'm just thinking, perhaps Matthew, you have also experienced this, certain titles like Ovid or somebody, where the undergraduates read them a lot because they're a little bit, more risque. And the only thing you can find that's risque is, ancient Rome. That means that there has been some kind of, selectivity in collection building, or at least in recording of borrowing habits. So, hopefully that's a useful reply. It's definitely something that excites me and that I think about. And I'm always thinking about those gaps, where things aren't written down or things aren't discussed.
One of the things that's come up in both projects is how much library practice varies from the actual rules. There's a lot of exceptions. Fines are rarely enforced as ferociously as they're supposed to be, and those sorts of things. And as Laura says, yeah, lots of times things survive in the collections in strange ways. So the Memoirs of Sarah Pritten, which is a very scandalous book, makes its way into St Andrews, and in a catalogue in the 1780s, in famous book destroyed, is written against its catalogue entry. But it comes in under the Copyright Act in the 1720s, so it's been there for half a century by that point. It's definitely gone out on a few occasions.
This, to follow on in this conversation, this is from Charlie Hambrick Stowe, a great supporter of the library. That Norbert, you mentioned that conflict generated by the wider public against the promiscuity of the circulating library. Are there other examples of disputes about what should be excluded or banned, and what to include during these earlier centuries? Does library history open any windows on social, cultural, political, I'd probably add to that religious clashes, similar to what we are seeing today? Are there echoes from this history?
Thank you. That's a really rich and interesting question that I will try to answer very quickly. Obviously, this is something we're all thinking about, as you can hear. So thanks for the question. Several points. So, for instance, I'm focusing on 18th century Britain, where sort of censorship was sort of more of a governmental thing and more at the point of publication. So sort of once something was out in the market, my sense is that there wasn't that much sort of censorship about it. The circulating library, part of what I find interesting and why sort of I try and research it is because it has this very particular connotation to it. And I mean, I could give, 10 or 15 examples of where in plays, novels, periodicals of the 18th century, one character or the other is knocking the circulating library specifically. I don't think the circulating library proprietors cared in particular. If anything, that probably, like censorship today, right? I mean, we know in libraries today, the books that in some of our states, people have tried to ban, the borrowing numbers for those shoot up. So I don't know if a circulating library would have, particularly minded if somebody had said, oh, circulating libraries are really awful, and why do they have these scandalous, books in? And that probably means that, customers, come in the door. So I don't think that's an issue. I think the subscription libraries, that would be an interesting thing. And I'm pretty sure Mark has looked at this, and maybe some of you guys have as well. We do have some records of discussions what to purchase for subscription libraries. So I think that would be where where sort of these discussions would have happened back then. That I don't know is maybe similar to a town council meeting today, where parents or groups or whatever start screaming about this book or the other. And then I think that this is the last thing. I think one of the interesting things to look at would be maybe identifying specific very controversial books like Thomas Paine, and seeing, okay, where is that actually, in which libraries, at what point, how much does it get checked out? So again, it would be sort of a micro history to try and answer that question. So I hope, again, I'm sort of groping because that's such a huge question, but I hope that sort of helps think about it a little bit more.
We connect up with institutional minutes, which often have some detail, although often included detail on those fights. There's a lot of libraries that connected with literary and philosophical societies, and John Mees looked quite a lot into those debates. And often those debates involve sort of avoiding political matters. So sometimes political stuff gets excluded from libraries. Thomas Paine does not appear in Books and Borrowing, interestingly. It may be that we have not transcribed the appropriate bits of certain library records, but it looks like the Rights of Man does not make its way into many Scottish libraries. The other thing that is often excluded from libraries of sort of self-consciously improving institutions are novels, although there are exceptions made. Walter Scott sometimes gets a pass, and some other people are allowed in. There is a certain suspicion of some kinds of politics, and certain suspicion of some kind of life writing, scandal memoirs, and those sorts of things. But those sort of discussions exist, but perhaps more in minutes than in materials that are directly involved in either of the databases at the moment, although minutes are fascinating and definitely a good subject for a future project.
Could I make a related point? I just want to be clear about, I think, both of these databases, right? I mean, the people on this panel are all academics. I hope it's clear that this is also supposed to be something that people just play around on and have fun with, right? This is not something where, you have to be a PhD student and think up your next project. This is something where you can just go on and look, okay, who owned, Mary Wollstonecraft, back in the day? So I just want to sort of put that plug in too, that it's, this is something to just enjoy and sort of from an completely unsystematic perspective. If you live in a particular place, what was the library there like? If you're going to go traveling to England over the summer and, you're visiting a town, what was there? So please do also sort of just, I'll say it again, play around on these things as well.
Absolutely. And to kind of share some a part of the grant, which I thought was pretty exciting and didn't get to participate in as much as I wanted, was do a book club around a book that was very popular that you've never heard of, right? Think about all these kind of undiscovered, and I realize that for many of us who spend a lot of time reading, sometimes the things in the past that have been forgotten are forgotten for a reason because they're not that great. But there are plenty of things, there are plenty of works that one could recover that actually are really quite fascinating, and that just because so much has been published, we've lost it. I want to, we're almost closing in on time. There's, I think, one thing that really struck me, and this might be news to the people watching the audience, is that the data that we are celebrating today, these 18th and 19th century borrowing records, is not data that anybody will have to study about us. So privacy and ethics concerns in 20th and 21st century libraries are different than those. And I mean, Laura, I know you're nodding there. What do we do with that? University.
Yeah, this is one thing that, especially when I talk to my students about this, there's a little bit of horror, because the idea that, everything you've looked at on Amazon or like your Google history, I mean, because, for these people, you go to the library, you borrow a book, you bring it home, maybe there's the assumption that, since the books that they have are curated, that there isn't something awkward about borrowing something unseemly that we might have now, where it's just like, the general garbage can of the internet. Sorry. I think that it is exciting to give us a chance to understand these tastes. And the kinds of things that these people do are recorded now, at least in terms of bestseller lists, and that kind of data isn't personalized as much to us, but it is something that we have a record of. So I'm interested in how those things align, but you're right that, it's very timely, and it kind of ends, I'm guessing, when mid-20th century, would you say? I'm trying to think of what the latest publicly available borrowing data we have is. No one alive, probably.
There's things like the Mock Middletown Red project, which is early 20th.
Yes.
There's a good Australian project on the Common Reader, which is mostly late 19th, early 20th. After that, it does get a lot more complicated.
Yeah.
Yes, we should all just be voyeurs and enjoy that we can go in and maybe find some of our ancestors and what they were reading. Remember in all of this to not be scared away by all those men's names, because there's plenty of evidence that men are borrowing for their families, or their families are in fact coming in and just using, put it on dad's account or put it on my brother's account. And that there are lots of diverse readers in here as well. And that it is a real treasure trove. There are many more questions that have come in. I'm going to share those with all of our speakers, and your emails are connected with them so they can get in touch directly. Sophie, just remind us, when should we refresh? When do we think this great database might be launched? Later this spring, early summer, or?
Definitely later this year. Late spring, early summer. It's a little bit out of my control now because unfortunately, when the grant funding ran out, I'm no longer actually employed on the project, but still very, very close to it. But yeah, definitely this year. But we will keep you posted. On your note about finding your ancestors, if you know more about your ancestors than me or anyone on the team, which I'm guessing you do, please contact us if you've got information about them that you want to update their record with. We do have a sort of contact us on the website for you to do that, because it's a huge amount of people for quite a small team to look at quite thoroughly. So yeah, any help really, really appreciated.
Yeah, I think that intersection is really fascinating. I don't think my family could read in the 18th century, but I'm very excited about the people who did.
And we don't have to wait, Matt, with books and borrowing. That's
Yes,
pretty
that's
pretty
true.
accessible, right?
That's there. It's a soft launch at the moment. We're doing a more formal launch in the spring, but you can go to borrowing.stir.ac.uk, play around with it. If anything breaks, email us. We're still trying to fix things and get the last bits of the data to line up. But it's mostly there. It can be explored. You can see all of the images of the actual registers as well. So we transcribed coming up for 150,000 records, but all of the other registers are there digitized in higher res versions online. So you can go and explore other bits of those we haven't got to in terms of transcription, or you can check our transcriptions if you're a bit suspicious. We did our best, but we will welcome corrections, emendations, and notes on improved usability. We've still got a bit of capacity for refining things at the moment.
Thanks so much, everyone, and we'll see you at the next event.